Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to welcome Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. I understand today we're going to be talking about communication and language, and I hope that we're able to manage to speak to each other in an intelligible way.
That's a very good starting opening observation. Uh, and also Robert Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Robert.
Good to see you, Arnie.
No
Yeah.
worries. Pleased to see you. Pleased to see you, brothers. Okay, the subject for today, the sabotage of language, and I'm going to start by bringing up some documents or historical writings that may be of interest to the discussion. The first one I was able, without too much trouble, to find 1984 by George Orwell on the internet, and also Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. But there's also a third document I wanted to bring up, and this was in regard to Dorothy L. Sayers. It's on the League website, The Other Six Deadly Sins, and I think it's part 5 of the 5 booklets that I've got there. And I think to me, it's interesting in it because the subversion of language, while it does many things, it also stifles thoughts. But I want to actually let Robert walk us through with this more clearly. Robert.
Yes, well, I was taking a look at 1984 this week in preparation for this talk. And in the book, Orwell describes how the dictionary for the entire political unit there is being constantly updated and modified. And basically, the modification consists of elimination of tens, hundreds of thousands of words to simplify the language. And one of the people working on this project tells Winston Smith, who's the main protagonist, don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak, now Newspeak is the new language they're developing for their civilization, which is designed to control everybody's thought processes. The whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought. In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. A pretty ambitious concept, eh?
Certainly is.
And in the end, later, this fellow says, has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the very latest, not a single human being will be alive who could understand such a conversation as we are having now? Well, I think that our civilization is undergoing this process because there is obvious sabotage of the meanings of words, and there is also the narrowing of the range of words. And well, people are fairly good with spoken language still. If you go on the internet, spelling has become a lost art. Young people just can't spell things anymore, and I think that's a dangerous thing because they confuse homophones, words that sound the same, and it's a dangerous development. But there are all kinds of words now that are trigger words that are designed to elicit emotional reactions, usually to the detriment of somebody, so that they are excluded from participating in discussion. Words like, racist or homophobe or Islamophobe, or, as soon as these words are pronounced and attached to you, probably the classic one is anti-Semite, then you are automatically discredited in the eyes not only of the speaker, but of the vast majority, well, I don't know what majority, a vast proportion of the population anyway, because they have been programmed to have an emotional reaction as soon as these words are uttered.
Okay, I think that's a very good opening salvo, Robert. Your thoughts, please, Wally.
Well, of course, that's true. I mean, language is a means of conveying thoughts. And, we are proposal beings. We have objectives, we have policies, we have, and those require programs. And to carry out programs, you have to have support. And so that you have to use your language in a way that generates support. And so you have to manipulate the meanings of words in order to bring on the support you're looking for. And that's, you see, language should ideally be a mechanism of reflecting the reality of the world in which you live, the objective reality. But if that reality is extended to policy, which is a metaphysical thing, it derives from philosophy or from ideas or from
Thoughts.
control mechanisms. And that's that's the important thing. That, you see, do we believe that there do we live in a world of chaos? Do we believe in chaos theory, or do we believe in a world that is in some way intelligently ordered? Well, the communist philosophy is that there is no God, and that they have discovered the it's contradictory in a way. They say that they have discovered an immutable process, or process of history, economic development and history, and social development. If it is inevitable, that would suggest that there's something that is about the universe that is ordered, right? Ordered according to their particular conception. But they believe that the world has been made in a certain way, which is imperfect and is developing, and that they are going to guide it. And because of their superior understanding of the process, they assume that they are entitled to guide it in whatever way works, not necessarily in a way which most people would consider as an ethical way, a fair way, an honest way. They have an objective, and it's all is fair in love and war, and they're at war with society. So all is fair, basically, and they use language in order to ascribe meanings to words which fit their particular narrative and their policy objective.
I think that's an interesting point there, Wally, and I just want to touch on this a little bit. I just want to actually expand on it. My experience with, we use the word, and I'm just trying to think of the, I've actually misplaced the word, but essentially it's an anti-bullying program, in schools. But in actual fact, it's a bullying program on the basis of anti-bullying. And I find that fascinating. They're actually brutalizing children in their thinking. They're brutalizing, they're conditioning their thinking instead of them actually observing the natural world and how things work and how families work and how community works. They're brutalizing them into if you like, a false narrative, and this becomes the new reality. And yet they claim that it's an anti-bullying program when in actual fact it's a bullying program. I find that to me it seems to be an argument on itself that just goes round in circles. I think it's the word cognitive dissonance. They sort of irreconcilable differences you place there, and you can't actually rationally think them through to conclusion. Okay. Wally, you want to continue, please?
Yeah, well, you're talking about the communist dialectic, the idea that you have to have opposites in conflict in order to develop further understandings or further institutions or practices or policies or whatever it is. And so it is cognitive dissonance because you are dealing in opposites. And when you deal in opposites to affect thought, you produce what is called static. That's cognitive dissonance. That leads to a lack of understanding. But what you're trying to do is guide thinking or thought process in a particular direction that is advantageous to your particular policy. And you're talking about bullying and bullying. Well, there's bullying and there's bullying. They're on opposite sides of the fence. It's an artificial situation that's been set up to create conflict in order to develop increasing social or government or state measures in order to control human behavior.
Mm.
It's fraudulent.
Mm. Mm.
It is an artificial situation, certainly. What the technique is to brand your opponent with the very thing that you yourself are doing
Mm.
in order to discredit your opponent.
Mm.
And it's surprisingly successful.
Yeah, I see that perhaps in the current phenomena, an athlete is being, if you like, ostracized and eliminated from his income because he appears to have offended someone. But in actual fact, all he's done is state his faith. But though if you like, the forever offended are actually the most offensive of the lot. And that is that they're brutalizing, in this case, the entire community, that you are going to fit into our narrative. We're going to brutalize you through the law, through the loss of income, through your security. We're brutalizing you because we are upset. And of course, this argument, this narrative, cognitive dissonance, they don't actually go together because
And it's all in the name of tolerance.
That's right, which
right.
is entirely intolerant. And
That's right.
and to me, I put the word on the table, and we might explore it later. The word Puritanism. Robert Klinck.
Well, I was going to say that another example is diversity.
Mm-hmm.
They say they're encouraging diversity, or criticizing diversity is a capital crime practically today, but they're eliminating diversity, consciously doing that. So again, you have this concept of cognitive dissonance. That's a key phrase to understand what's going on in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And once you have that in mind, and you start to look at news on the television or in newspapers, whatever, you'll see it everywhere. You just stop and you'll find that there's something in there that doesn't accord with the rest of the article, and it sets up a conflict in your mind. And I think this is being done at that subconscious level. Very important that people become conscious of it so that they're defended against it.
Yeah, no, to me that's most profound, because you could put it. Another thing that I'll put on the table, if you like, is the way that cults work, and that is the conditioning of the mind. Why would people be so, if you like, subject to control by a leader, by a charismatic leader? And this conditioning of the mind appears to be something that the leader is able to achieve over certain people being more susceptible to it. And so what we're looking at, if you like, mainstream media or the elites or the politicians or industrial leaders being those leaders, is we're essentially being conditioned to follow them unquestionably in a if you like, an aura of adoration towards them, which of course is absurd because they're only individuals the same as we are, and they still have mud on their boots and everything else that makes them a frail human being. Wally Klinck.
Well, that's right. In the cult, the leaders tend to separate. They want to inoculate their members from the rest of the cultural milieu, because the rest of the cultural milieu will mitigate against the control that these leaders have over their select group of people. And they want to solidify that control. So they have to try and minimize the incursion of other ideas which might moderate it or change it or expand it. And that is a policy. But it's an exercise of the will to power. And you see, that's it. Do we live to enjoy seeing other people become as human beings, or do we live to enjoy the euphoria or the perverse pleasure of controlling other people?
A totally different philosophy. That's exactly right.
It's a totally different approach to
totally
life.
Different, yeah. So there is this conflict of ideas, and the outworking of that conflict ideas, of course, is the perversion of our language. Robert Klinck.
And these cults typically develop specialized terminology so that their little community, sometimes very big community actually, I think the whole society is being cultified, their society is isolated from the broader society and is more easily controlled.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you see this with Scientology and this thing in the United States now, and Nexium. They all had their special terminology, so that the people within that group didn't relate to the larger society. And if you want to look at cults, I think the Communist Party is a perfect example, almost a model, because you get involved in communism and you're going to be dealing in a vocabulary of running dogs and parasites and, you know, proletarians, whatever that is, the toiling working class, and democratic centralism. There's a good one, you know, democratic, ruled by the people in the group, but centralism, because once the decision is taken, there's no more discussion. You just obey. And so you live in this fantastic world of abstractions and, you know, political swear words, and it controls you. And then they have the phenomenon of self-criticism. So periodically they get everybody in a big group, and anybody who has had a bad thought is supposed to confess it. Anybody who has suspected another member of having a bad thought or doing an unacceptable thing will denounce the other person. So it's a tremendous control on people's behavior, and it essentially terrorizes them.
I read a book not long ago by a bloke called Mayer, Mayer. It's called Brainwashing, and it was in regard to the Korean War and how effective the Chinese communists were in brainwashing about 95% of the American soldiers. I say 95% because that was the group that was targeted. How effective the brainwashing was on each individual is an outworking of each individual, but they attempted to impose brainwashing techniques over the 95%. And the degree of success was quite high. And this self-criticism, this perversion of language, if you like, sabotage of language, is all part of that whole, if you like, narrative that I read. And if there was ever a document similar to 1984 or Brave New World, if there was ever a document that actually illustrates what we're experiencing through the mainstream media, through the TV, the radio, through all sorts of outlets, it's that document. And once you read it, you realize, by jingoes, this is everywhere. It's perverse and it's permeating in every facet. Why are there TVs in the hardware store, in the doctor's clinic waiting area, in anywhere that people are gathered, and it stops them from talking and communicating? And the narrative continues. The morning shows, it's all about politically correct thinking and this, that, and the other, and it's all there constantly at you. And it's unrelenting. No wonder they released TV when they did, as a tool of control. Wally Klinck.
Yes, you know, psychology, that things can have a genuine side and a false representation. And psychology can be used using the concepts of scarcity and guilt. Those are two key things which are imposed.
Fear and guilt. Yeah, fear and guilt.
Yeah, because if you can demonstrate that there is scarcity, then of course, obviously, anybody who doesn't try to overcome the scarcity is a bad person. So if you can demonstrate that scarcity does not have to exist, you lose that power to control a person because the guilt is not there. But guilt is a really important thing. Now, it's important that we understand, you know, human thought and motivations and the behavior that comes from it. But we have to be very careful about the philosophy or the approach that we take in dealing with those subjects. Do we deal from the standpoint of love, or do we deal with it from the standpoint of life is a war? It's a conflict. It's a competition. So if you believe in abundance, wherein there is not room to contain.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have reason for envy. You don't have reason for fear. And those things which generate negative types of human reactions.
Mm-hmm.
As Douglas said, he said, you know, I mean, when people react adversely, when you annoy them, maybe the intelligent thing to do would be to stop annoying them.
Stop annoying them. That's exactly
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Yeah. I was in discussions in this last week with a fellow. We were talking about carbon dioxide and the as a plant food. And there was a point of view placed on the table about the imminent, if you like, destruction of the world based on this increasing greenhouse gas. And I see in my mind's eye that if plant food carbon dioxide is actually placed in a greenhouse environment, the plants grow more prolifically. And if that's the case, like adding fertilizer to the plant, then that means that there is a greater food production. So not a scarcity, but in actual fact an abundance. Now, I look on it and I think, well, okay, you place an abundance as a philosophical point of view, then surely in order to recognize that abundance or that scarcity, you just walk outside. Now, and I did. I drove around quite a bit and I looked outside and there was rain and there was wind and there was crops being ploughed and there was seeds growing, and it was an abundance. I drove over an area the size of Tasmania last week, and one of the states in Australia, and in that I saw crops everywhere. I saw an abundance, not a scarcity, and I think that that's most profound. But the key to it is you've actually got to go outside and look at it. It's not a theoretical point of view. It's actually you observe the actual outworking of it and go into the, if you like, the garden that is the world, and look at it and just say, by jingoes, there is so much. And the silos that are built, they're not pulling them down because there's not so few grains to harvest. They're actually building new silos. And so that means that there's more and more production. So this CO2 is actually giving us more and more food. Now, just to clarify the false narrative, if you go to Yemen or you go to Venezuela, those political systems are collapsing either through war, when I say physical as in war as in bombing, which is going on by the Saudis in Yemen, or it's going on in other means by the Chinese, the Russians and the Americans in Venezuela. And probably, in my view, the actual government of Venezuela is complicit in it. And that is, you turn the power off, you have no fuel, you have no running water because the pumps are shut down, you've got no electricity, the whole thing just collapses. And so Venezuela is in a dire position, but it's in a dire position because of political situation, not because of the natural world. The natural world is one of abundance. What should have happened in Venezuela was the people should have been released to actually work the land, produce the crops, be autonomous, be independent. But because they were so reliant on the government for everything, when the power is turned off, the whole thing collapses in a heap. Robert Klinck.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Venezuela is a country where food is literally dropping off the trees half the time. You know, it's not a country where food production is difficult at all. So it should be a minor problem to provide nourishment for the population.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, Arnie, I don't know, about a month or two ago, I was driving down the road and I saw a whole bunch of kids, high school students, I guess. They all had banners. The world is coming to an end.
Mm-hmm.
Someone has told these kids that unless something is done immediately to reverse, I guess, carbon dioxide release or whatever, the world is going to end in 12 years. It's that precise.
Mm-hmm.
And these kids are out demonstrating.
Mm-hmm.
They're being released from class to go out and do this demonstrating.
Mm-hmm.
They're being released in every city in Canada, and I imagine every city in the Western world at least, to do this.
Mm.
So how do you explain that there's such a coordination of this propaganda and thinking? And you know, that it could be that there are elements in society who are trying to misdirect the language or sabotage the language. But the news media are cooperating fully with this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how many times will you see homophobia in news articles today?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, that is a ridiculous word.
Mm-hmm.
It just means anybody who has any reservations about homosexuality
Mm-hmm.
is an evil person, or evil, or at least mentally ill, because he's got a phobia.
Mm-hmm.
But it means that you cannot discuss the issue,
Mm-hmm.
because any discussion of the issue arises from an irrational fear, Islamophobia, homophobia, all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the thing is, how is it that all these media simultaneously across multiple countries adopt this language? And I can tell you, back in the 1970s, I discovered that newspapers have a specialized lexicon, and it specifies the terminology that reporters are allowed to use. And if you step out of that terminology, you're jeopardizing your career. This was a revelation to me. I thought, well, columnists and newspaper reporters write what they think in the language that they have learned in their education. But there are strictures on the kinds of language you can use. I haven't seen a recent guide after seeing this thing in the 1970s, but I'm sure it still exists, and I'll bet it's a lot longer than the one that I was familiar with.
Mm. That's fascinating observation, Robert, because to me, as we said earlier on, language, you actually use words to instill or to convey thoughts. And if you actually restrict language, then you're actually stunting your thoughts. You're stunting it. Whereas if you go after, if you like difficult, we used to have spelling bees in at school, and each time you learn to spell a word, but if you did what you should do, it's not only spell the word correctly, but also understand the meaning, the nuances of the word, the inflections in it, the slight variances in having one, two, three, four different words of similar meaning, but each being unique in itself. The one, two, three, or four different thoughts from an approach towards the same word. Fascinating when you think about it. It's a development of thinking. That's what education is about, developing your thinking. And then, of course, taking it out into the real world. I think it was it classical education is grammar, the meaning of words and the use of them, logic, to think things through as you actually understand those words and their meaning, and then rhetoric, to debate them so that you can bounce them around in your mind's eye. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, a classical education. Interesting subject. We could go on this for a long, long time, but I'm going to pull us up 28 minutes and just call for closing comments. We'll pick it up again next week. Wally Klinck.
Yes, you have to understand that we operate by policy, which gives us administration, which gives us results. You have to have some kind of an origin of an idea in order to carry through any program or to do anything in this world. The real power in this world exists with finance, with banking ultimately, because banking controls those financial credits, which under our particular way of doing things by contract and money, is absolutely essential to the carrying out of any function. And banking operates on the basis of centralized power. You know, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and all of the central banks and so on, from one nation to another. And so obviously the whole thing is controlled. And finance is concentric with, and by saying concentric with, I mean they're obedient to the policy and the philosophy that stems from the apex of the financial system. So, you know, these things don't just happen spontaneously. They are given direction. And when you consider that the financial system is world-spanning, and the media itself is also world-spanning and interconnected, it is not surprising, as Bob said, that you will see this type of thing emerging. Well, it'll emerge all over the world almost at once.
Mm-hmm.
Something will come up, and then all of a sudden you'll see, yeah, same thing in Australia. Same United Kingdom.
Safe
So
schools.
something
Safe
is
schools.
working in unison. They're working in collaboration or in cooperation or in unison.
Sorry.
And I don't think it's just by, it's not just by intuition. It is a concerted, organized program to carry out a certain policy.
That was, thank you, Wally. That word I was looking for earlier on, brutalizing children, was called safe schools. And in actual fact, our schools are nothing like safe. Our children are being brutalized every day by our indoctrinators. And I won't call them educators because they're not. They're nothing like it. Closing comments, Robert Klinck.
Yeah, it's an interesting exercise to look at definitions in the Oxford English Dictionary published in the 1920s. It was a huge undertaking. I think it was published in 13 big volumes. I have a condensed version in 2 volumes. It's printed so small you can barely read it. But I looked at a few instances there. One was the word egregious. Now, egregious to anybody living today means utterly horrible, disastrous, very bad, as bad as it could be, egregious. Well, the meaning in the 1920s was distinctly excellent, because Grieg is collective, it's association, and E is coming out of that. So it's somebody who stands out from the crowd because he has excellent qualities. And this word has been taken and turned into its exact opposite. It's a funny process that would result in that. The same with the word discrimination. It used to be the ability to make fine distinctions, to analyze things in an intelligent, perspicacious way. Now discrimination is just a terrible crime, a terrible sin, So it's another word that's gone. Another word that I looked up for the fun of it was Judeo-Christian, and it didn't exist in the 1920s. So 1900 years didn't develop that concept, but somehow it's grown since that dictionary was published in the 1920s. I think it actually was invented about the time of the establishment of the State of Israel, because it has lots of political advantages for the cause of Zionism. Anyway, that I found to be an interesting exercise, and I'm sure there are many other words that you could analyze in a similar way.
Thank you for that, Robert. I just to close out my thoughts on today's forum, the sabotage of language, and I put it to you that if we look at the mob, if you like, the mob, you never really see unique and distinct individuals. You never actually see the ferment that causes the dough to rise, but it is actually the unique individuals. And in the pursuit of excellence in any field, whatever that field is, language being one of them, in order to clarify your thoughts and take your thoughts further, I think it's quite distinct that it's the unique individual that brings things forward, not the mob. The mob, if you like, is it the Gadarene swine? All they're good for is to go over the edge of the cliff. But it's the unique individual who can salt the whole loaf. This is Arnis Luks at the Freedom Forum. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Wally.
Thanks, Arnie.
Yes, thank you, Arnie. I think we have dealt with what might be referred to as witchcraft.
That's right.
Yes,
yeah,
that is exactly right.
No worries. Thank you, gentlemen. Cheers, ladies and gentlemen.